So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy spring, finally spring, to join us for tonight's Pollinator Series webinar, where this evening we will be hosting Emma Erler from the Squam Lakes Natural Science Center to be talking about native plants and the pollinators they attract. Before we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge that this presentation is streaming to you from our state headquarters in Concord, New Hampshire, which is located within the site of the ancient village of Pennacook in Endakina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. I would like to acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and our ancestors, the Alnambak, who have stewarded Endakina throughout the generations for thousands of years. New Hampshire Audubon is honored to continue the stewardship of these lands, providing opportunities for all people to form connections to the natural world through our programs and wildlife sanctuaries around the state. I invite you to learn more about the Indigenous presence on the land you occupy by visiting the website native-land.ca. Here, you can explore and click on territories of Indigenous people and get connected to resources to learn more. For a more in-depth understanding of the Granite State, where it seems like about 95% of you and us are logging in from today, be sure to check out all the educational resources found at indigenousnh.com. Some quick Zoom information before we dive in. We do have about 90 people registered for this evening, or I'm sorry, 107 people registered for this evening's talk. So you'll see that we are in full webinar mode, which means that we cannot see you and you can not be heard because you're on mute and the videos are off. So feel free to crunch, munch, sip, sup, and hang out while we dive into our program. Please feel free to use the chat for any thoughts, comments, and reflections you might have throughout the program, and reserve the Q&A button for any questions that you would like answered by tonight's presenter. For those of you who joined us a couple weeks ago for our last pollinator webinar, I believe that was the Hummingbirds as Ninjas, thank you so much for returning. And for those of you who are new to tonight's pollinator series, we welcome you and are thrilled that you chose to join us. Before we jump into tonight's presentation, I would like to take this opportunity to briefly describe how this webinar fits into the larger mission of New Hampshire Audubon. For those of you who don't know, New Hampshire Audubon is a state-based environmental nonprofit organization that is completely independent from national Audubon. We rely on members and donors like you to support our charitable mission, which has 4 programmatic pillars. Conserving about 10,000 acres of wildlife sanctuaries throughout the state for habitat and recreation, researching trends and discovering solutions for species in peril, connecting people to nature through environmental education via school programs, field trips, summer camps, and webinars like these, and lastly, advocating for sound environmental policy here in New Hampshire to protect the environment for wildlife and for people. If you're interested in hearing more or considering becoming a member yourself, please feel free to check out our website. If not for folks like you, we would not be able to complete our charitable mission. So we thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight's presenter is going to be introduced to you by one of our amazing senior biologists, Diane DeLuca. Diane, when you are ready, please take it away.
Thanks, Willa. Appreciate your introduction and being co-host. So we are incredibly pleased to have Emma Erler as our presenter tonight. Emma has generously shared her expertise with our New Hampshire Audubon webinar participants in the last 3 years, and we are thankful to have her back tonight. Many of you know Emma through her work with UNH Cooperative Extension over the last few years, and in that capacity, she has shared her talent and knowledge with a wide audience. This spring, Emma transitioned to Squam Lakes Natural Science Center and is currently their horticulturist. Her expertise is in ecological landscaping and native plants, and she provides educational programming on numerous gardening topics, including gardening for pollinators and wildlife. She also manages the Kirkwood Gardens in Holderness, New Hampshire, which is a free public garden that is open daily, which focuses on beautiful and sustainable landscape practices. And I'm sure she will share more of this special place with you tonight. And tonight, Emma will be highlighting the relationship between native plants and the pollinators they attract. So many thanks, Emma. We're excited.
Well, thank you so much both for the intro. It's certainly good to be here tonight. And let me, while I gab here a little bit, see if I can share my screen and get my presentation going here. Beautiful. All right. So I'm assuming everybody can see that. Just my intro slide here. So like Diane said, and Willa before her, I currently work for Squam Lakes Natural Science Center, and my expertise is really in plants. So while I'm giving a talk tonight on plants and pollinators, keep in mind that I'm not an entomologist. I know a lot more about the plants themselves and how to grow them. And it's just through my own interests that I pay attention to who's actually visiting these plants. So if you have a pollinator garden now, if you're thinking about putting in a pollinator garden or just looking to enhance your landscape to bring in more beneficial insects, hopefully this talk will be for you. So like was said before, if you have questions as I'm going along, please do pop them in that Q&A and I will answer them as best I can. So with a talk like this, where we're talking about native plants, I find it helpful to right off the bat discuss what is a native plant. Well, believe it or not, native plant has kind of a what's the word I'm looking for? It has many different definitions, if you will. For some people, a native plant means a plant that would naturally grow in a particular environment. So for example, we could be talking about plants that you would only find growing in the wild in New Hampshire in a particular habitat. More broadly, in the garden center and nursery industry, a native plant typically means one that is found in North America. So there are many native plants that, or at least things in the horticultural world that we call native that, you know, aren't necessarily native to New Hampshire or even New England for that matter, but they grow well in our climate and they can be of great benefit to our landscapes. So a couple examples here. Purple coneflower and foam flower, Tiarella is the genus of the foam flower, it's sometimes called that. These are two plants that are pretty much always marked as being native. However, that purple coneflower, that Echinacea, is not native to New Hampshire. It's really native to the prairie states. That being said, it grows really well in our climate. And as long as you provide it the right growing conditions, even though you wouldn't find it growing in an open meadow in New Hampshire, you can certainly grow it here. And there's a lot of benefits to it. In exchange, this other plant I showed, the foam flower, Tiarella, this plant is in fact native to New Hampshire and it's blooming right now. So if you were to go out hiking in the woods, certainly in north central New Hampshire where I live, you would find this in bloom. And probably in the mountains, it's going to be coming into bloom in the next few weeks. All right, so there's the native plant part. And I should note here too, just before I move on with native plants, you can decide how much of a stickler you want to be with this. For my purposes as a gardener, when I am using native plants, I like to think of that as being just plants that grow in North America or are found growing in North America pre-Columbus, if that makes sense. I don't restrict it to just things that are endemic to New Hampshire, although some people would perhaps, have their preference for just really strictly native. All right, and so next, the other part of my presentation here is the pollinators themselves. So I'm going to touch on these guys briefly before I dive into some plants that you're going to want to think about adding to your landscape if you really want to enhance habitat. So there's actually a whole bunch of pollinators out there. What often gets overlooked is that the wind is one of the most effective pollinators in the landscape. Anybody who has allergies is probably appreciating wind pollination right now, myself included. And water too is often a source of pollination, more in tropical climates than here. But what we're most concerned about are the animal pollinators. For most gardeners, you're going to be thinking about bees and butterflies, maybe hummingbirds when you think of pollinators, but this also includes flies. There are many, many species of flies and beetles, and even wasps and hornets that will do some pollination. And I should say moths too. Moths make the list. I do have a picture of a bat on this slide. Bats are not important pollinators in New Hampshire, but they are if you're out west. Bats can be important pollinators of some cacti. So here's our whole list here. The honeybees at the top there, these guys are clearly not native, but they are important, particularly agriculturally. Native bees, of course, and all these other guys that I just mentioned. And then humans. I put humans on there as a last resort because we also pollinate plants, things that we are concerned about with agriculturally, and also when we're breeding plants, we're doing the pollination ourselves. So, you know, this whole pollination thing with insects and wildflowers, for a plant to require an insect or animal pollinator, it's a pretty costly process. Attracting pollinators in general is costly. That plant needs to produce pollen and oils and nectar as a reward for pollinators to do that pollination. And this definitely has an energy cost. But this type of pollination tends to be very effective, high success rate, provided those pollinators are in the area. So, you know, when you're making these materials that are attractive, these pollen, oils, and nectar, those pollinators will feed on those materials, or at least collect them, and then distribute pollen to other plants. So in this talk tonight, I am only going to be talking about plants that are visited by pollinators, that are pollinated by a pollinating animal. I am not going to be touching on grasses. That being said, a lot of grasses are really important for beneficial insects and pollinators. Actually, a number of grasses and sedges are host plants for butterflies and moths. So though I'm not going to touch on those because they're pollinated by wind, not by animals, they're also a key part of the landscape. So to start with, you know, bees. Bees are definitely the most specialized and effective animal pollinators. Most bees are generalists, so that means that they will visit a whole bunch of different flowers, and they'll use, you know, many plants from many different genera and families. A very small percentage of bees are specialists, and that means they only visit one or a few types of flowers. So the pictures I have here, the bumblebee on the left is a generalist pollinator, which means it's going to utilize a bunch of different flowering plants, pretty much whatever's out there that it can get pollen and nectar from in a time period it's going to be using, versus the squash bee on the right, which is really specialized and tends to only use plants that are in that squash family. In our gardens, typically we're going to be serving more of those generalists, although if we know specialists use a certain plant, then, you know, having some cucurbits around is certainly going to be serving squash bees potentially. Honeybees are worth mentioning because when people are concerned about saving or preserving pollinators, a lot of times the honeybee is what's put out as the poster child for pollinator preservation. These guys are not native, they're introduced. They were actually introduced quite a long time ago by European settlers, and they have to be managed. Honeybees, you know, their main purpose here is to create honey and wax that is then used by people, although they're also used for pollination in commercial farming as well. The worldwide population of honeybees is threatened by this colony collapse disorder with a number of contributing factors. So honeybees are in trouble, but what a lot of backyard gardeners at least are most concerned with is providing good habitat for all of the native bees that are out there versus just honeybees. Although if you're a beekeeper and you're planting for your honeybees, you're certainly going to be serving other pollinators as well. Native bees are really diverse. There's about 400 species of native bees in New Hampshire alone, and 4,000 known species in North America. And they're really important to agriculture and natural ecosystems. If you don't keep bees, or if there isn't somebody in your neighborhood who keeps bees nearby, chances are if you have a garden, particularly a vegetable garden, you're relying on native bees to do that pollination for you. And there's evidence that populations of many species may be declining. So providing them habitat is a very good thing. Native bees, at least in one study, were shown to be more effective pollinators on a per bee basis than honeybees. For one thing, they tend to forage earlier in the morning and later in the evening. They forage for pollen more often, looking at you bumblebees. And they'll also forage in cool and damp weather. So that's an important thing, particularly looking at weather like we had today, or really what we've had a lot of this spring. A lot of the native bees collect pollen on their abdomens and backs rather than pollen sacs. So this is also helpful in terms of actually spreading pollen from plant to plant. And the native bumblebees use what's called buzz pollination, where they vibrate their wing muscles and release a whole bunch of pollen that sticks to them. This is clearly helpful for a lot of plants. Things like blueberries really wouldn't get the job done without these guys out there. And then native bees can potentially make honeybees more effective pollinators just by harassing them. So if you have a whole bunch of different species of bees around, they're probably going to be chasing each other around, or chasing each other off of flowers and making them all more effective. Another big group here is the butterflies and moths. I would wager that most gardeners know a lot more about butterflies than moths because they're much showier. Also, they tend to be more day active. They're certainly the most conspicuous pollinators, and a lot of people get interested in butterfly gardening specifically just because these insects are so interesting. They seek nectar only, so they are what I would call an accidental pollinator. They're not collecting pollen, but some may stick to their bodies. So while they move from flower to flower, they may accidentally pollinate plants. They, at least in the case of butterflies, prefer sunlight and warmth. So to have these guys in your garden, you do need to have a sunny space. You're much less likely to see a lot of butterflies in a shady garden. So maybe don't have that be your focus if that's your environment. And moths tend to be nocturnal, so they're going to be most active at night. And these guys require host plants. So that means that they need a plant that their larvae, their caterpillars, can eat. These are often not the same plants that they forage on as adults. And sometimes it's very specific, like in the case of the monarch, which must feed on a milkweed. Many feed on multiple species of plants, but those plants need to be around in order to have the moths and butterflies. Flies are another big group of pollinators. These guys tend to be generalist foragers, and they're also seeking nectar, much like the butterflies. So they're not going after pollen. If they do pollinate flowers, it's just because some pollen accidentally got stuck to them. And some of these guys actually mimic the coloration of bees and wasps, as you can see in this picture here, of a bee fly on the left, a tachinid fly over here on the right, the bee fly is in the upper right, tachinid fly, and a hoverfly. Beetles too, these guys don't get a lot of attention, but beetles definitely represent the greatest diversity of pollinators. In general, there are just so many beetles in the world. It's remarkable. They were actually were the first insect pollinators of prehistoric plants, which is kind of cool. And they're still important for flowers with really ancient characteristics. Think water lilies or magnolias. These are really ancient plants that don't have a real sophisticated way of spreading their pollen. Actually having a bunch of beetles in there knocking around inside of their flowers does a great job of pollination. So important to have beetles for some of these ancient, beautiful plants we like to grow. Most beetles are eating pollen. And some of them get a bad rap in the garden because they tend to mess flowers up. They'll chew on the flowers themselves. They might chew on the foliage. They're pooping on those flowers. So a lot of them might be considered pests in some cases, like that blister beetle in the upper right corner there. But they are really good pollinators, at least for some plants. And there are some plants that purposely are attracting beetles too. Also goes for flies. Wasps. So wasps are another one. These guys also are not nearly as effective as bees. They often get mixed up with bees, but they have smooth bodies, unlike the hairy bodies of bees. So they don't actively collect pollen. And wasps really aren't there to collect pollen either. They're there to get that sweet nectar. As adults, wasps need carbohydrates to eat. That's why you always think of yellow jackets going after that sticky can of soda that you have at the picnic. During their larval stage, they're actually carnivores, so often they're eating other insects. And these guys too are accidental pollinators, but they're still out there doing work. And lastly here, birds. In New Hampshire, the only bird that we're really talking about is the ruby-throated hummingbird. They have these long beaks and tongues for tubular flowers, as I'm sure everybody in the audience already knows, and they can see bright colors. And it's well known that hummingbirds tend to prefer some of these red and pink flowers that are really bright and flashy, that have a tubular shape. So, increasing local pollinators numbers is something that you're going to accomplish by increasing available flowers. Now, makes sense, right? The first thing you're going to want to do is to incorporate a succession of flowers to provide blooms throughout the growing season. So if you haven't ever really thought about pollinator gardening before, this season, it would be great to pay attention to what you currently have in your landscape and make note if there are ever any gaps of time where you don't have anything blooming. The ideal landscape is going to have something blooming from early spring right up until frost. So keep an eye out for that, because there's very likely a chance that you could be adding something to your landscape that's going to increase the length of time that you have available pollen and nectar available. You're also going to want to include different flower species known to be good sources of pollen and nectar, or butterfly host plants. Turns out that not every pollinator is going to use every plant. You know, I mentioned that many of these guys are generalists, so they'll visit a lot of different flowers, a lot of different shapes, sizes of blooms. But when it comes to some flowers, some pollinators simply just can't access them because they're, for example, a tubular shaped flower might just have too deep a throat for a short-tongued insect to be able to access nectar and pollen. In general, native plants tend to be better if we're thinking about pollinators and really ecological landscaping in general. You don't have to worry about native plants becoming invasive in general. They also, provided they are sited appropriately in your landscape, require fewer inputs, fewer pesticides. And what I said there about being sited correctly means that you are looking at what the plant's growing requirements are and matching those with your site. So if you have a very dry, sandy soil and with a garden in full sun, you're probably not going to have a lot of success with a woodland plant that likes a rich, organic, consistently moist soil. So even though it's native, you still have to think about where it would be found growing naturally and make sure that your site is a good location for that particular species. And then the last note here, go pesticide free. As much as possible, try to avoid using pesticides in your landscape. If you have to use some herbicide, you know, I certainly will manage invasive species with herbicides, invasive plant species. So the big thing here is skip the insecticides and use as little herbicide, fungicide as you can get away with. You know, just because of deleterious effects on pollinators there's a lot of conflicting studies out there on pesticide effects on insects. But in general, you know, the less poison we put in the landscape, I think the better. Plant diversity here is also key. So we definitely first want to focus on making sure we have something blooming throughout the entire season. And from there, it's, I think, important to try to have a bit of diversity throughout the entire growing seasons, rather than having just one thing blooming in the spring and then one other plant that blooms in the summer and one that blooms in fall. Try to have, you know, at least 2 or 3 things that are blooming in each season. In a natural habitat, you could easily have 50 or more things flowering at once that could be serving pollinators. In a cultivated landscape, you know, I would aim for at least 9 species, but you could always do more. So like I said, at least 3 things that are blooming in spring, 3 or so that are blooming summer, 3 in fall, and build that up as you go. Particular pollinators can be supported with their key host plants too. So keep that in mind. If you are really interested in butterflies or moths, then it's worth looking up what the host plants are for some of these species so that you can make sure that those are around so you can potentially host those plants. I should note that moths and butterflies are the only insects that we're thinking about when we say host plant, because those caterpillars are eating those insects. I suppose you could be thinking about beetles as well, but most people aren't particularly, at least gardeners, aren't interested in feeding beetles in their landscape, although you certainly could be, and you will be no matter what. But the flies and the wasps and the bees, those guys are all eating pollen, or they're eating insects or some sort of rotting material as they're developing. So you don't need plants for those guys when they're growing up, but you need them certainly by the time they reach their adult stages. All right, and then just another note here on diversity. You'll also want to include a diversity of plants with different flower sizes, shapes, and colors, as well as varying plant heights and growth habits. And that's just to serve as many different types of pollinators as possible, because we know that not everybody is going to go to every flower. Some physically won't be able to utilize every single flower. And then the more you can make your planting resemble a natural native plant community, the better, right? So the more you can really fill up space, you know, cut down on that bark mulch, have things clump together as much as possible, really the better off you're going to be. Here is a table that is from the Fish and Wildlife Service, I believe, that covers, you know, just some of the traits of flowers that certain pollinators tend to be drawn to. You know, this is certainly not exclusive by any means. Like right here on this chart, we see that beetles are attracted to dull white or green. But you're like, wait a second, I've seen rose chafers on my red roses. It's like, well, of course, right? This is just a generalization of what these different groups tend to prefer. You look at all this and you're like, wow, that's a lot of information. Really, for me, the takeaway is just to have as many different types, shapes, colors, sizes, heights, widths of flowering plants in your landscape as possible. And you're going to be serving a whole magnitude of different species. Worth noting, like I said, that this is just an extension of that slide, that colors attract pollinators. Those butterflies are often attracted to those pinks and purples. I think that's partly why butterfly bush is so incredibly nice for butterflies. It also produces a ton of nectar. Those reds for the hummingbirds. And then you'll see here a fly on a white flower. You'll definitely see more flies on white and yellow flowers. And then moths tend to be attracted to those light color flowers too, which makes sense given that they're mainly foraging at night. So that white is going to register better after dark. And if you ever get into having a nighttime garden, which I have certainly seen at really high-end botanical gardens, pretty much using just white plants. Click through that for you. Okay. And then the shape here definitely aligns the type of animal that pollinates it. Large butterflies, flies, and beetles tend to prefer blossoms with flat heads, like that Queen Anne's lace there. It's very easy to land on, to perch on. Whereas hummingbirds and long-tongued bees tend to like these tubular flowers, like the wild Columbine here on the right-hand side. And bees too are going to have preferences. Honeybees have short tongues and they like plants that have clustered flowers. Long-tongued bees, on the other hand, prefer tubular blossoms, or often they're the only ones that are really going to be accessing those tubular blossoms because they have a long tongue that can reach down inside that flower to access the nectar. Vibrational pollinators, such as bumblebees, often prefer bell-shaped flowers. So something like the comfrey in this picture here on the right. Think of your blueberries, your tomatoes, your eggplants. These things that have these tubular flowers are definitely probably most utilized by bumblebees. And from just a design standpoint, as well as a functionality standpoint in the landscape, putting in large blocks of one plant will be more attractive to pollinators. And what do I mean by that? Well, I would say as a good rule of thumb is to have at least 3 of whatever you're putting in. So don't go out and buy just one of everything. If you can afford it, try to have 3, 4, 5, 7 of a desirable plant that you're putting in so that you're growing a big block of that plant. It definitely looks more natural when you plant that way in the landscape. It's also ultimately going to be more attractive. If you're a professional landscape designer, that's exactly what you'd be thinking about, is having big sweeps of a certain type of plant. And then make sure you're using vertical space to create layers of blooms. So that's a cup plant over there on the right, considered invasive in some states, despite being native to North America. It's just an aggressive grower.
Hey, Emma,
The point here being that
I don't think we're seeing the photos.
height here. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I don't think we can see the photos. Can you click a button and see if it'll, yeah, there we go. Okay, beautiful. Thank you. And sorry for the disruption.
You know, I didn't do anything, but I'm glad that it came through.
Magic. All right, keep going.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for interrupting your
Slides. Yeah, so an aster over there on the left, you know, having a big sweep of aster, great. And then over here on the right, you see a butterfly bush and cup plant. But the point just being that when you garden for pollinators, you don't need to be just at ground level. You can be using a whole bunch of height in that landscape too. And you're going to end up serving more insects that way. Okay, so here's the fun part for me. And this is where I'm going to talk a bit about specific plants, suggested pollinator plants for New Hampshire gardens. These are all plants that I have a lot of experience growing. And I will note that I'm also going to focus on species that are native to New Hampshire, or at least native to Eastern North America. Few of these guys you're not going to find in the woods in New Hampshire. We just don't have the right types of soils. But if you have a cultivated landscape, you can easily grow things that grow in the wild in New York. All right, so let's start with the spring bloomers, because this is where we're at right now. One of my favorites, and it can be a little bit tricky to find in the nursery trade, although you can certainly buy seeds for it and even plants online from some of the big native plant dealers, is wild lupine, Lupine Perennis. This is different from the lupine that probably many of us are familiar with. The lupine that you would go and see, say at Lupine Festival up north in Sugar Hill. Those are Western lupines. Those wouldn't really be found, or they wouldn't be found naturally in New Hampshire. But believe it or not, there is a native lupine. It's this one right here that looks slightly different with this paler blue, purple, white top to it. That has a slightly shorter stature, typically, gosh, I would say no more than 12 to 18 inches. But that very similar look to the Western lupine. And it's really important for a lot of insects. It's utilized for nectar for a whole bunch of different insects. But it's also the host plant for the Carner blue butterfly, as well as painted ladies, whites, and sulfurs, other types of butterflies. Carner blue is a very rare butterfly. You don't find, it doesn't have a huge population in New Hampshire, but where you find it, it's where this lupine is found. Typically, you would find this plant in really dry pine barrens, so it tolerates really a dry, sandy soil in full sun. So if you're thinking, I have really crummy garden soil, this might be a plant that you try, just because it does not require a whole bunch of coddling. And it's certainly one that would be blooming very soon. Might already be blooming in the southern part of the state. I haven't been down to check out the patch in Manchester that I used to check on. But typically in May or early June, you're going to be seeing this plant in bloom. Golden Alexanders is another really great plant for pollinators. This is a member of the carrot family, Apiaceae, and it has that flat top flower, very similar to carrot or Queen Anne's lace that you might be familiar with. This is a plant that tends to grow in wet areas in the wild, and it forms very neat and tidy little clumps. I'd say typically no more than 2 or 3 feet tall. Has these nice yellow flowers, and it does provide pollen and nectar for short-tongued bees, wasps, flies, and beetles. And it's a host plant for black swallowtail. Black swallowtail lays its eggs and its caterpillars develop on plants in the carrot family. So you could grow parsley in your garden just for the black swallowtails, or you could grow this plant, this Golden Alexanders, the Zizia, instead. This is one that definitely prefers a moist soil, even a wet soil. So I would definitely reserve this for the garden that has a really consistently moist soil and an organically rich soil. If you have dry soil, ignore this one and leave it for somebody else. You might find this at a local garden center. You're probably more likely to buy it from a specialty native plant grower. Wild geranium is one of my favorites as well. This is a New Hampshire native, so you could potentially find this in New Hampshire. Not usually under a white pine, in a white pine dominated forest, but if there's a whole bunch of hardwoods overhead, chances are you could run into this. The nectar and the pollen are used in this plant, and it does attract a whole bunch of different insects. It's usually listed as being a really good butterfly plant, although certainly flies and bees will use it as well. This one also likes a nice organically rich, moist soil. It will grow in a drier soil or porous soil, but it won't spread very quickly. Otherwise, if you have a nice, or just I would say average garden soil, or more of an organic moist soil, this thing will naturalize on its own. So it's one that will spread by seed on its own. And it's just about ready to bloom at Kirkwood Gardens in Holderness. So I imagine it might already be blooming in the southern part of the state, and within the next week or so, it's going to be blooming up here.
Hey, Emma, can you go back for 1 second to see if there it is. We're getting the pictures as a lag, but there we go, folks. That is our gorgeous wild geranium. Thank
Bummer
you.
on the lag.
I know, it's very bizarre, but we'll get it. We're getting it.
We
have
talked
something to look forward to. We get all the facts and it's like, what does it look like?
What the heck does this thing look like? Well, I'll have to go a little bit slower then to make sure these come up. I swear, no matter how many things I do on Zoom or how many things I've done online since the start of the pandemic, there is always a technology issue of some sort.
Always. You are not alone.
Just keep letting me know if you don't see these.
This one's perfect. We got it.
Perfect. I'm glad. All right. Thank you, Google. Okay, so wild columbine, I mentioned this one already, Ecologica canadensis. There are a lot of other columbines out there. Many of them are Asian, many of them are hybrids, but this is one that you can find growing in the wild in New Hampshire. My favorite spot is in Rumney, New Hampshire, near Rumney Rocks. Tons of this there. It is a really good nectar plant for hummingbirds. It's often quoted as being one of the best native plants for hummingbirds. It's also visited by bumblebees. The spurs on the back of the flowers is where all the nectar is. So you really need to have a long tongue or a long beak in order to access it. And then bumblebees too, and some sweat bees will use pollen from this plant. This is a true native New Englander that does like part shade, so full sun if you have a lot of moisture to your soil, part shade if things are a little bit drier. And this will spread quite readily if you have just an average or organically rich soil. So I would absolutely let this go to seed. Don't deadhead this plant and let it spread on its own. Really, a prime plant, I'd say, for pretty much any garden, as long as you have sun and some moisture. Another one of my favorites, and this is in full bloom right now at Kirkwood Gardens in Holderness, is wild blue phlox, Phlox divaricata. There are a number of different phloxes. Not all of them are native to North America, but this one is. This is not a plant that you would find growing in the wild in New Hampshire, but you could find it potentially in Western Vermont or New York. It's pretty common across most of the states in the northern United States. Just doesn't make it into our acid soils in New Hampshire. That being said, it can be grown really successfully as a woodland plant in New Hampshire. So where it has some partial shade or light shade, plenty of moisture. This one does like a consistently moist soil. It's going to do really, really well. In my own garden, which has a very dry sand, it clings on as well. It doesn't spread as readily as it does in a really rich organic soil, but it does grow. And this one is visited by a whole bunch of insects as well. But what I'm probably most excited about seeing on this plant is hummingbird clearwing moths or sphinx moths. And I've actually noticed a bunch of hummingbird or clearwing moths on the phlox that is at the garden that I work at, Kirkwood Gardens, in the last week or so since this has been blooming. And, just that lovely blue color. Okay, on to the summer bloomers. I'll pick up the pace here because I want to make sure I have enough time. Smooth Penstemon. There's a lot of Penstemons out there, but this is the one that is native to New Hampshire and you could potentially find in meadows in New Hampshire. Kind of looks like a snapdragon. With that tubular flower. It is good for bees that have longer tongues, like those bumblebees, and butterflies will certainly use it too. The straight species just has a green leaf, but you can find a lot of these red leaf varieties at garden centers, like this Husker's Red on the right. This often is added to wildflower seed mixes, and it does do well in both dry soil and average garden soil. So you could try this really if you have a poor soil in your garden or if you have really good garden soil. Chances are that this is going to do okay. And plant this one in full sun. All right, wild bergamot, also called bee balm for many of us, or wild bee balm, Monarda fistulosa. This is another mainstay really for anybody who has a pollinator garden or is interested in supporting insects and hummingbirds. Long-tongued bees do really well with this. Bee flies and hummingbirds, as well as hummingbird moths. You can see the swallowtail over there on the right feeding on it. And it's actually a host plant for the hermit sphinx moth, this guy on the right. So maybe not the sexiest looking moth there, but interesting all the same. So that would be a hornworm caterpillar, not the ones that eat tomatoes, ones that eat Monarda. This plant does like dry soil, doesn't necessarily do really well with drought, but as long as you're watering occasionally or we're getting rain, if you have a drier soil, that's fine. Or just like a medium, well-drained soil would work well. This is often a plant that's incorporated in rain gardens, kind of towards the upper edge of them. Butterfly milkweed is definitely one of my favorite milkweeds for the landscape. The reason for that is that it forms nice tidy clumps as opposed to the common milkweed, which spreads everywhere with rhizomes. The nectar and pollen of this plant is definitely used by a variety of bees, butterflies, skippers, which are a small type of butterfly, and hummingbirds. And as I think probably everybody on this call knows, it's a host plant for monarch butterflies and for milkweed tussock moth caterpillars, those guys over here on the right. I, in my own garden, have seen, despite I've read before that this is not a preferred milkweed for monarchs. in my own landscape, the monarchs always seem to go straight for the butterfly milkweed over the common milkweed that's nearby. So absolutely gets a lot of monarch butterfly use, and it's gorgeous. This does prefer a really poor, dry soil and full sun. You will struggle to grow this if you have a really high quality garden soil. So if you have that poor soil, grow this. And it does take a while to become established, typically 2 to 3 years. But if you're patient, you'll end up with a really nice plant. And then Culver's root. This is something that I would like to actually incorporate into the Kirkwood Gardens. There isn't any now. This is another plant that I would say is native to Eastern North America. You won't find it in the wild in New Hampshire, but you'll find it in a lot of native plant gardens because it's this really striking 4 to 5 foot tall plant with these big spires of flowers that are going to be blooming from the end of June through August. It is nice for a whole bunch of different bees, both short-tongued and long-tongued, and you'll see a lot of butterflies visiting it as well. This needs, or I shouldn't say needs, but definitely prefers full sun, and it really doesn't tolerate dry soil. So if you grow this, you will want to make sure that either you have irrigation, that you're watering, or that you have a very moisture retentive soil. And then I think my last one for summer here is Joe Pyeweed. Eutrochium maculatum. This is a New Hampshire native. You'll find this growing all over the place along wetlands and swamps and along rivers in New Hampshire, blooming in late summer. The nectar is really what attracts insects to this plant. And if I could have one thing in my garden, or if I was asked, what do I think one of the best pollinator plants is, this would be it, because it is always just humming when it is in bloom. The caveat with growing this, of course, is that you do need to have full sun, and it does like a lot of moisture. Think where I was telling you that it likes to grow in wetland margins and along the edges of rivers. It does tolerate inundation occasionally, and it does need a lot of moisture. So again, not one for the dry soil. And then our autumn bloomers here. So for the end of the season, New England Aster is always a winner, and this is very easy to find at garden centers just because it is such a nice grower. And of course, you'll find it in the wild too. Nectar and pollen are utilized on this plant, and it's the host plant for a couple of different, or I should say several species of checker spot butterflies and crescent butterflies. That's a checker spot, Harris's checker spot, I believe, over here on the left on hawkweed. So really nice. Tends to like a nice, rich, moist soil. You could grow it in full sun or light shade. And then New York Aster, really similar to the New England Aster. It's just slightly shorter in stature and has more of this pale lavender color. It also likes full sun and is definitely going to like consistent moisture. Rough goldenrod is another really nice plant. Rough goldenrod tends to be used in landscape settings more than many of the dozens of other goldenrod species, just because it behaves nicely and has these nice pendulous flowers. It's a really good late bloomer. So this is something that's going to be out there, August through October potentially. And one that you'll actually see a lot of flies and wasps on at the end of the season. And it is a host plant for the silvery checker spot butterfly there. Sneezeweed, this is another one going to be really easy to find in garden centers. And I should mention a lot of these are going to be really not that difficult to find. This is another just dynamite plant for pollinators, really serves just about everybody out there. And it is a really late bloomer. So we're talking like September through October. Sneezeweed absolutely needs a moist soil, not for dry soil at all. It will fail pretty quickly. But if you have at least a medium soil in your garden that's well drained but has good moisture holding capacity, or if you have a wetter soil in your garden, this plant is going to do really, really well, and it is just going to be absolutely covered with insects. And then closed gentian, Gentiana andrewsii. This is not the gentian that you would probably find out in the woods in New Hampshire, although it is native to the Northeast. That is bottle gentian. I mentioned this species just because this is one that you will be able to find from native plant sellers or garden centers. That's the one that they tend to sell versus the Clausa, which is not really in retail. This is just an interesting plant because it has those flowers in that picture there, which hopefully you can see, are as open as they're ever going to be. And they actually rely on bumblebees, their strength of bumblebees, to be able to push those petals apart to access the nectar and pollen within, which is really pretty cool.
Oh,
Just a few trees and shrubs for you. American basswood is a really awesome plant that a lot of beekeepers pay attention to. This is a 60-foot tree at maturity, so not something for the small landscape, but beautiful, beautiful, or at least really lovely scent on the flowers and nice heart-shaped leaves. So then those flowers will be blooming in June. So really nice tree that is native to New Hampshire. You'd find it growing. I usually see it along rivers and streams and wetter areas. Black tupelo, also called black gum, is another really nice native tree that is used by bees. If it's pollinated, it will form these fruits that are eaten by birds. It has really lovely fall color. This is one that can be grown in a variety of soil types, although if you were to find it in the wild, it would be growing right next to water. Serviceberry is a native plant that is actually getting utilized a lot in landscapes, which I think is wonderful. Both its nectar and pollen are used. And if you're out there right now driving around, chances are you've seen some serviceberries in landscapes, or perhaps you have some in your own. But this is another one that's great for pollinators and also great for wildlife because it does have edible fruits. Oops. And last two here, high bush blueberry. Another real powerhouse here for bees, really importantly pollinated by bumblebees. So if you see a lot of bumblebees around and you're a blueberry grower, that's a great thing for you. One that shouldn't be grown in wet soils, despite the fact that we often see it growing near wetlands. It doesn't like to have its roots totally soaked. So it would like to have a nice even moisture to the soil, but not be totally saturated. And it also needs a very acidic soil. So that's something to check out. And it's a host plant too for the striped hair streak butterfly, which is really beautiful. Then my last shrub here is sweet pepper bush, Clethra alnifolia. This is another one that you can find growing in the wild in New Hampshire in select locations, typically along wetland margins or along ponds, streams, you name it. Full sun will tolerate a lot of different soils. I have it growing in a very dry, sandy soil, and it's spreading very slowly. But if you put it in a really nice quality garden soil, it will spread like mad. And this fills a nice niche in the shrub category in that it blooms in the summer. So this is one that'll be blooming typically in July and August, where many of these others are blooming in the spring. And it does tend to be totally covered too in the springtime. Just a quick note here before I leave a few minutes for questions is on nativars, because I figured somebody might ask. A nativar, maybe you've heard this term, maybe you haven't, is just a name that's been given to cultivated varieties of native plants, kind of clever. So cultivar, we're calling it nativars. A lot of people might get worked up, or some people certainly do get kind of worked up about using these in landscapes over straight species native plants. And in some ways, I think there's reason to be, a little concerned about these because they may not have quite as much value to pollinators or to other wildlife. For example, when you have double flowers like this double bloodroot down here on the bottom, that left picture, or that razzmatazz coneflower up there on the top, there's just not as much functioning reproductive parts to those flowers. So there really isn't that much pollen or nectar available for pollinators. So while they look really neat and beautiful, they're not actually that functional in the landscape. And you may not, there's certainly been studies that have looked at the use of different colored plants or plants that have different colored foliage or different colored fruits by wildlife and by insects. And sometimes there's no difference at all, and sometimes there is. From personal observation, I can say when it comes to winterberry, that the straight species winterberry fruits tend to go a lot faster than some of the hybrids or these bright gold colored berries, like on winter gold. So no hard and fast rules here. Most nativars are produced vegetatively, i.e. clonally. So you've lost some genetic diversity in the landscape. But I don't think that's the end of the world. Most of these plants, as long as they don't have double flowers, as long as that flower still looks like that native flower, it's probably still going to get visited a lot. And if you are going to a garden center to shop, chances are what's going to be offered in the native section, if they have that, is going to be a bunch of these cultivated varieties of the native. So I'm not a purist by any means. I think there's a lot of merit in having some of these guys in the landscape, the ornamental landscape, where we're looking for that visual impact. But a lot of the straight species plants are really gorgeous too. So I urge you to, just go with whatever, makes your heart sing. If going all native seems like too much of a stretch for you, I see no issue with striking out and using some of these nativars. And interestingly, if you want to know more about that, the Mount Cuba Center in Delaware does a whole bunch of plant breeding and trials in their landscape where they look at pollinator usage of some of these cultivated varieties. And interestingly enough, there's on some of the cultivated varieties, there's actually more insect visitation and use than on the straight species. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. And if we have some questions out there.
Don't stop sharing quite yet. Actually, Emma, can you pop back in? We weren't able to see the New York Aster photo.
Oh,
or
yeah.
the sneeze weed. So if you want to just pop back in and just have it in the background.
Yeah.
I think the New York Aster looks
That's
very,
such a bummer.
That's all good. We got most of it and it gave us something to inquire about. So I believe the New York Aster looks very similar to the New England Aster, but sneeze weed will be a fun one for us to see a visual for. And while you're looking for that, I'll open up or actually, Diane, do you want to open up the Q&A? Because we've got some awesome questions coming in.
Okay, so hopefully
Sure.
I'll
wait until Emma shows. Yeah.
Yep, the New York Aster is coming in loud and clear. Beautiful. Right. Thank you for sharing. So it's just a little bit lower growing than the New England. Is that correct?
It's a bit lower growing. Yep. And the bloom time's a little bit later than New England Aster.
It's a bit paler too, right? New England's more of a robust indigo.
Yeah. What I should note is that New England Aster and New York Aster are I would say probably most often cultivated species, and the two that have been fussed with the most with plant breeders, particularly New England Aster. So there are probably dozens of cultivated varieties of that plant. So you can find New England Aster that's like a vibrant fuchsia pink. You can find it in a really deep purple, or you can find it more of that kind of blue purple color that be in the wild. New York Aster, not quite as crazy, but there's definitely some different shades of blue with those different cultivated varieties.
Wonderful, thank you. And then I think it was 2 ahead was the sneeze weed. So there's the golden one. There it is. All right. Super.
Yeah, and this is one that you wouldn't be likely to find in New Hampshire, but it is found pretty much across the rest of the continental U.S.
Gotcha.
And it grows well here, provided you have that very moist soil.
Super. Awesome. Thank you so very much. I hope that answers everyone's visual questionnaires.
Yeah, I'm sorry that goofed a little bit.
It was all good. We got it.
Tell everybody I'm using a Chromebook, which is new to me, and Google Sheets or Slides, Google Slides.
Yeah. So. Oh, bless you.
Yeah.
All right.
So, Emma, we'll start with Lisa's question, and she wanted to know, why are some insects called accidental pollinators? That implies that some do it on purpose.
Oh, yeah, that is a great question. So none of them are doing it on purpose. they're all after something that flower is offering, and that flower, if you will, if they had brains, they're kind of tricking that insect into doing it. Accidental pollinator is just a term that's applied to some of the insects that really aren't all that effective pollinators, and that plant probably was never intending for that insect to come visit it. So it is really interesting evolutionarily how some of these things developed, right? So you have some of these flowers like that closed gentian that really, the way it's designed, only those big burly pollinators with long tongues can get in there to access it. And so, you know, while a flower could be visited by a whole bunch of insects, a lot of times there's kind of an insect group that would be the ideal to pollinate that plant. And so while the bees really are the primary pollinators out there, some of these other guys will visit those flowers and do some pollination. So like a bee is the target for, let's say, this aster, but a fly is probably going to be attracted to it too for its nectar. And that fly might accidentally move some pollen. So it just kind of happened as an accident. It wasn't necessarily the target. And that's kind of a real interesting just side branch to look at, right? Like how some of these plants have evolved alongside different pollinator groups. Like I was mentioning with some of these really early ancient plants like the magnolias and the water lilies, where beetles, they were the guys that were out there at the time, and beetles were the intended pollinator for that plant. There are other plants that are really just looking to attract flies, for example, some of these things that are meant to smell like or look like rotting meat. Go out there and look for skunk cabbage. You could be out there right now in the woods looking at what's the word I'm looking? Jack in the pulpit. That's blooming near me. And that plant's not looking for a bee to be in there. It's really trying to attract those flies and maybe even some beetles.
Thanks, Emma. That was a great explanation. So Kathleen asked a question that is asked often. Don't most garden centers still use systemic pesticides like neonics?
You broke up a little bit
And
there on my end.
Okay.
Oh,
Don't
sorry.
most garden centers still use systemic pesticides like neonics? And isn't it essential to purchase pollinator plants from nurseries that don't use pesticides?
That's a great question. So the garden centers and the nurseries probably aren't going to be using any neonicotinoids at all. They're unlikely to be doing any treatment. Where that would be happening is actually with the big plant producer. And a lot of them are going away from that just by consumer demand. That's still it's a really contentious area of research right now, looking at neonicotinoids and their impact on pollinators. The studies out there are really conflicting. Some, you look at the data and it's like, well, yeah, these are definitely killing bees, and others, it's just like, doesn't really seem to be having any impact at all. So people on both sides of the aisle, the chemical companies and the producers are saying like, I don't know, like it's pretty inconclusive. And then people that are, you know, totally diehard into bee research are saying like, these things are definitely awful. What I will say about that class of chemicals is that they, from a applicator standpoint, are a lot less toxic than the stuff, and environmentally a lot less toxic than what the alternatives are. The alternatives are the organophosphates often. So it's a really tough issue, whether we go backwards and use some of this really hardcore stuff that we know is really, really dangerous for human applicators and not great for the environment, or whether we stick with some of these quote unquote softer chemicals, the neonicotinoids, which have far fewer health implications for the humans that are using them, but potentially some negative impacts on pollinators. So all that is to say that, yeah, when you buy a lot of plants, chances are it could have been treated with a neonicotinoid, because those are used particularly for a lot of the soil-borne pests. Unclear. There isn't enough research to really indicate how long those last in plant material and whether they are whether that chemical is going to show up in pollen or nectar in a harmful amount and who it's going to impact. And we just don't know. For me personally, it wouldn't, knowing that a plant could have been treated by a neonicotinoid at the big wholesale grower before it got to the garden center. I know at least that there was like an EPA approved window of time that had to have been done when that was applied and when it could go to sale. But beyond that, I mean, it's tough, right? Ultimately for me, it's like, just get these plants out in the landscape. I don't think these chemicals are going to be out there forever. And for me, I'm more concerned about a loss of habitat versus a plant that might be tainted. Granted, that's just me, and I'm sure plenty of people would totally disagree. But it is something that plant producers are looking at, and it is possible certainly to find plant material that is totally neonic free. Again, very long-winded.
Thanks, Emma. I'm going to jump forward just to share a couple of questions that kind of go along with that last question. So is there a website you've ordered plants from that you can recommend?
Ooh, a website. Well, there's a bunch of growers out there. I'd say two that sell a lot of wildflower seeds and some native plants, small sizes, would be like Prairie Moon Nursery and Prairie Nursery. Those are two of the bigger mail order guys. And for something like that wild lupine that I mentioned, that would probably be really your best chance of finding that. Pretty much every other plant I mentioned, if your garden center is focusing at all on natives, and more of them are just by consumer demand, you should be able to find those locally. And there are even some local native plant growers too. Bagley Ponds, is that what it's called? I think I messed it up.
Yeah, that was the next question, actually. Gwen cited that there was Bagley Pond perennials in Warner, New Hampshire. But is there a list of native nurseries beyond Bagley Pond?
Ooh, not that I know of. That's kind of an emerging thing. In New Hampshire, I'm not aware. Like, one of the big wholesale growers in New Hampshire, Van Berkom Nursery, produces a lot of native plants, and those plants are going out to garden centers in New Hampshire. So I know that stuff's likely to show up there. I would say too, if you have a local garden center that you like, just mention to the staff or the owner that this is something that you're looking for. The garden center that's near me, they'll actually, source stuff specifically for me when I've requested it before. They'll hunt it down, ship it in, and just gets them thinking like, okay, we should probably have more of this stuff in stock. I went to Lowe's a few weeks ago and actually found native witch hazels there. And I bought a couple of them, which I thought was really cool. I had not seen, and they had native service berries too. So it's the native plant movement, I think, is really starting to catch fire. The fact that the box stores are paying attention.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they're totally native, but Foundwell Farm in Pembroke, New Hampshire, and they're only open like maybe 3 or 4 weekends the whole season, but I think they do a lot of native plants there as well.
Here is like a wicked native plant enthusiast, I would say go down and check out Garden in the Woods. It's a garden that's operated by the Native Plant Trust. That's all for the most part, I think they stretch it a little bit, but plants that are native to New England. And they have their own nursery, Nasami Farms, and they have a big retail garden center section at Garden in the Woods, where you can buy a whole bunch of the stuff that I just mentioned. So worth a nice day trip down to Framingham, Massachusetts. Really right about now. Before, by mid-June, I'd say get down there.
Great. So I'm going to jump back up now. And Donald asked about Japanese knotweed. A bad invasive is buzzing with insects in late summer. Is there anything good going on there?
I would say that that's probably the best part about Japanese knotweed. And I've heard from many beekeepers that like having it around just because it is such a good late season source of nectar. I don't know that it's good enough to warrant keeping the plant. I mean, I think it's what one redeeming quality, and I think Japanese knotweed is here to stay. I cannot imagine that we're going to be able to eliminate it in the landscape in New Hampshire. So it's going to be out there. It is providing that benefit to pollinators late season. But it's also, its detriment is that it completely takes over natural areas, and then we lose the diversity of all these other plants that are going to be filling out the entire season with blooms. So that late season bloom is not quite enough for me, but I won't grudge it, the spot a couple houses down from me where the people that live there aren't going to manage it. Say like, well, at least the bees can use it.
So another question about, is summer sweet helpful for pollinators? And she said Wigelia. So Nina, I'm not positive which
Summer
plant
sweet.
you're.
This is where common names get a little hard. So
Yeah.
summer sweet is sometimes a name that's used for clethra, the one plant that I mentioned. I think I've also heard it applied to the native spirea before. Both of those are great for pollinators. That clethra is nice because it's kind of a late summer bloomer. If we're talking about a spirea, then those are also kind of midsummer blooms and are totally visited by bees and butterflies. Weigela is not a native. I believe that's actually of Asian origin. You will see insects visiting it. I've seen hummingbirds visit it before, certainly bees and butterflies. And let me just note that I don't see any reason for not having some non-natives in your garden. And frankly, that's what a lot of us have to begin with. A lot of the non-natives can be really excellent sources of pollen and nectar. There's no arguments there. The issue, if you only have non-native things, is that you're not providing a food source for native insects. So there isn't anything for native butterfly or caterpillar larvae to eat, as well as, all the other, thousands of insects that we have in our gardens that are neither good nor bad, but are an important part of the ecosystem that need natives as a food source.
Thanks. So Gwen, actually the question is about clethra. Can clethra get by with just morning sun?
Yeah, it totally can. The downside to having less sun for clethra is that it just won't bloom as well. You won't have quite as many blooms. But yeah, there's no reason not to plant it. It's still definitely a good native. If you don't have quite as many blooms, it won't be quite as showy for you or quite as good for bees and butterflies, but it's worth a try. It's one that I would caution against planting as a foundation plant just because it spreads by suckers really aggressively. And it can be annoying if you're trying to put it in a more formal setting for that reason. But if you have a spot where it can naturalize and just kind of do its thing, and you're not worried about keeping it neat and tidy, that's really where it thrives.
Thank you for
That's great.
answering that. Before we continue with questions, Emma, I do want to acknowledge everyone that we are over time right now, and Emma is an amazing guest speaker who is already up to her ears with all sorts of things going on because she juggles a lot. She's been very humble this evening without adding additional things to the plate, but she's truthfully juggling a lot. And with it being spring, and with you guys being gardeners, you are probably well aware that you too are juggling a ton. So Diane, if you want to pick maybe one more question, and then perhaps those of you with additional questions, we could potentially email them to Emma. And maybe when she has more available time, as it's getting late, the sun is setting, we can reach back to that.
Yeah, that sounds like a great plan. Thanks, Willa. I'll ask this question. I think other people probably have had the same experience. I used to have lots of bee balm for years in a woodland-like area, and they are declining to only a few plants. Any ideas why?
Well, few thoughts. Bee balm is a perennial that can sometimes crowd itself out. It sometimes would prefer a bit of management. So dividing it might be helpful. If it is getting too shady too, you might see a decrease. It is a plant that really thrives in full sun. Another thing that could be impacting it too is if this is an area without a lot of airflow, a lot of humidity, could be getting hit really hard with a fungal disease called powdery mildew, which unfortunately bee balm is just known for, particularly the native species. Some of the cultivated varieties have been bred for powdery mildew resistance, but heavy infections of powdery mildew year after year after year can sometimes really take a hit on the plants. But I guess, yeah, if it's in full sun and it's still declining, I guess I'd get in there and dig up those clumps, space them out a bit. You may, I don't typically say this, but you may want to amend the soil a bit, at least add some compost to that area so that there's a bit better water holding capacity. It is one that it does prefer there to be some moisture. If it's just a totally dry site, it does tend to peter out over time. Whereas if you put it in a perfect garden soil and in full sun, you are going to be beating it back. But it's also one too that people are often looking to get rid of. So ask around in your gardening community, and it's likely somebody has some to give away. These plants in the mint family tend to be very aggressive.
Thanks, Emma. That was really wonderful. I'll just share that there are more pollinator webinars coming up this spring. June 2nd, Heidi Holman will be sharing Butterflies of New Hampshire and the work that they're doing in monitoring butterflies through New Hampshire Fish and Game in collaboration with some of the other conservation organizations around the state. And on June 23rd, Nick Dorian from Tufts will be speaking about native bees. He's a native bee specialist. So we'd love you to join us for both of those programs. And I will share that on June 12th, Sunday, June 12th, from noon to 4, Bagley Palm Perennials will actually be at the McLean Center in Concord and doing a native plant sale. So if you're interested in adding native plants to your gardens, that would be a great opportunity to come and look at some of the plants and potentially pick some up. And last, Emma is also going to join us for this, is that June 25th, we're having a BioBlitz of the pollinator habitat at the McLean Center in Concord, which includes our pollinator gardens and also some emerging pollinator meadow habitat. So if anyone's interested in joining us for that, we'd love to have you as well. And I will turn it over to Willa, but I just want to acknowledge that these pollinator webinars are being funded through the Benjamin and Gertrude Couch Trust, and we're very grateful to them for allowing us to put on these presentations, and very grateful to Emma for sharing her time this evening and her incredible knowledge with all of us. So thanks, Emma. I know it's a really busy time and we really appreciate you being here.
It is, but anytime anybody, wants to reach out, you can find me on the Science Center website, or you can come visit me at Kirkwood Gardens in Holderness. I'm there every Monday and Thursday.
So thank you guys all so very much for joining us this evening for what was an incredible talk, so informative, such a unique angle. I feel like we hear so much about the pollinators, but it was really impactful hearing about some of the select plants that we can choose to include to encourage diversity and support these amazing humming, buzzing, fluttering friends. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Diane. And thank you, all of you guys who joined and tuned in this evening. Stay well, stay healthy, stay wild, and we hope to see you all soon. Enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody. Thank you again.